Excellent. Well, welcome to the people who have arrived on Zoom so far, and welcome to all the people who are here in real life. It's lovely to be running events in real life yet again. We used to do it all the time, but of course it's been a rare thing over the last year and a half. So it's great to be able to have this event here tonight. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on in this area here, the Yagara and the Turrbal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge that because we're on Zoom, we are zooming out onto the lands of many different Aboriginal people. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. So on that note, I'll tell you a couple of bits of housekeeping. For the people who are here on Zoom, you will be on silent through the event, but you can send us a question if you want. And those questions will be able to be in the chat bar. And Louis will be sending you a link to the book of the moment, which will show you where the chat bar is. So when that link turns up in your chat, you'll know that's where you can actually chat back to us and ask questions as you go, and they will be texted out to me, all very technical, and hopefully we'll get some questions from you guys at the end, and hopefully we'll get some questions from people who are here in real life. So for people who are here in real life, if you can put your phones to silent, that would be great, so that they don't go off in the middle of the event. People at home, you can turn your phones up as loud as you want. And for the people here, there are toilets that are very easily accessible. If you go out that door and right to the end, there's a lit toilet cubicle out there, so it's easy to get to. People at home, I hope you know where your toilets are. I certainly don't. And I'm going to be tweeting a few photos and ideas out on the Twitter at avidreader4101 is what I'm tweeting from. So feel free to join me if you're here or if you're at home as well. So it's really exciting to be hosting this book, Amnesia Road, which is Luke Stegmann's new book. And it is front and centre at the counter for purchase. And if you happen to be at home, that link that we are sending out to you will be a link to purchase. And if you do want a personally signed copy and you're not here in real life, just ring us on 07 3846 3422 and we will get payment for it and get a copy signed to you at home and send that out to you if you need it. So that's all well and good. So I'm going to hand over now to our wonderful host for the evening, Simon Cleary. Simon is an author, a dear friend of avid readers, and his work includes the novels The War Artist, which was his latest book, but also Closer to Stone and The Comfort of Things. Simon is an amazing writer as well, so I am looking forward to this great conversation between two very big brains. Welcome to Simon Cleary.
Thanks for welcoming Big Brain Chrissy. And before we begin today, I'd like to acknowledge some other traditional owners, and that's because Luke's book, which we'll talk about shortly, Luke's book.
Now, this was the microphone that worked perfectly the other day, so I think that it's not the mic's problem. I think that it's probably a connection between the box and here. So I'm sorry if it drops out. We bought new mics to help this working, and you've got one of the new mics, but if this is happening on this, it means that it's a connection issue. So sorry, it seems to be working now.
Maybe it's my fault.
I don't think so.
All right, we'll see how we go. Shortly, we'll be discussing Luke's book, and Luke's book covers and explores territory around southwest Queensland. And that being the case, what I wanted to do is to acknowledge some of the traditional owners of that country, and in particular the Andalusia people, the Big Umbrel people, the Kunja people, the Bajari, and the Kulila people. We're here today to celebrate Luke's book, and it really is something that's worth celebrating. It's an extraordinary book. It's an extraordinary exploration of a range of issues involving culture and landscape of southwest Queensland, as well as Spain, in particular, Andalusia. Before doing that, can I just read out a little bit about Luke's history for those of you who aren't familiar with Luke and with his work. Luke is an Hispanist and a cultural historian based in rural southeast Queensland. He's held senior positions in media, publishing and higher education in Australia, Europe and Asia. He's written on art, politics and history for a wide range of Australian and Spanish publications, and his book before, Amnesia Road, is The Beautiful Obscure, which is also a beautiful piece of cultural exploration of the links between Spain and Australia. He has received the Malaspina Award in 2018 in recognition of his outstanding contributions to the development of cultural relations between Australia and Spain. And we may hear a little bit more about this during the interview. He is a boxing referee, and as a boxing referee, he has travelled all around Australia and in particular Southwest Queensland. So with that introduction, Luke, can I just hand it over to you and perhaps to introduce something about your work?
Thanks very much, Simon. Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming along. I mentioned to Simon earlier today that before we started talking about the book, I just wanted to spend 1 minute remembering my father. This book is dedicated to the memory of my father. My dad was born in West End, just up the road here in Bristol Street, about 3 or 4 blocks away. And I always associate West End with my father. And Dad grew up in a very, very poor family. He had to leave home. He had to leave school at 13, 14 years of age to work to help support the family. He never got the education that he wanted. But later on in life, as a mature age student, he went to university. He ended up doing a master's degree, and his great passion was Australian history. So I just wanted to remember my dad, who's a West End boy, and very much thinking of him tonight. And this book is dedicated to his memory.
And he's handed a passion onto you, Luke.
Thank you.
He really has. Luke, your book deals with serious topics, sobering issues, and issues which have been challenging for this country for at least 2 centuries, and which continue to be difficult for us. But as much as you deal with those very difficult topics, and we'll begin to talk about these in a moment, you write beautifully. You write extraordinarily beautifully, and the way that you write communicates something of your passion for this subject, but also for your love of country. And so I wonder whether we can start with a reading from your book, and in particular a reading that says something about Southwest Queensland, about this country.
Sure, indeed, I'd be delighted to. Thanks, Simon. This book has a subtitle, Landscape, Violence and Memory, and originally I'd never even conceived of a subtitle, but the publisher said you could put a subtitle on it. And those 3 jumped out at me because essentially that's what the book is about. And I think in some ways, while I'm very, very grateful for the reviews that the book has had so far, they've tended to focus on the violence and memory rather than the landscape. And the landscape to me was one of the very most important parts, because one of the first things that got me thinking as I was travelling around South Queensland was how do you come to terms with the fact that the place which is so beautiful has such terrible history? And you could apply that to many different parts of the world, of course. But anyway, so thanks. This is a brief, it's just 1 page. If you bear with me, I'll just take about 2 minutes. This is a brief description of some of the elements of South West Queensland. And I say, for there is no compassing the landscapes of Southwest Queensland. They are an indigenous home, a place of life, sustenance and meaning. For millennia, they have been lands of richness, ceremony and exchange. For those of us who came later, feeling our way half blind through the inner rooms of the continent, There is no ascension to knowledge, no communion of equals. These landscapes cannot be boxed or taxonomized. They cannot be fenced or fixed. The wires and roads that cross them are temporary fictions that give some brief level of access before disappearing. These landscapes predate and will outlive us. They are in every dimension larger, wiser, and more nuanced. They are essentially indefinable. Try as we might, the languages of the European traditions fall short of capturing their flowering dimensions. Poets stumble before their aching beauty of dark blue quiet and mauve space rimmed with gold and orange thread, the beauty of bony grasses, a skyline of old man saltbush crinkle. Their creeks and rivers are incalculable, bending and bending in lazy curves of caramel and ochre. Ignoring all human ambition and vanity, they are transcendental. They are both unadorned and impossibly rich. They are the Yapanya stand at noon. They are hairy panic and lignum tangle, purple love grass and the bloodwood tree. They are black box and river gum, matuka grass and cockatoo, sulphur springs and parrots. They are dog fence and currajong, ironbark and cypress pine. They are sandalwood and guandong, nadu, gargaloo, coolabah and needlewood. They are wilga, parakelia and white flowering shin-cracker. They are thargominda nightshade and the native apricot. They are emu apple, mulga snake, sago bush and yellow belly. They are hawk and eagle on the wing. They are the softest air and dust storm days. They are home to the million ways of floodwaters of branch and anabranch. They exist within and beyond the turn of seasons. They are sweet, gentle and unforgiving.
Wow.
Just beyond the turn of seasons. That's beautiful. You obviously love that country.
I do very much. It's just saying to your friends before, it's over a period of time, and as you can say, I've travelled a lot around Australia and lived in different places around Australia, and there's so many marvellous places, but I do believe that the stretching from sort of Roma, St George and right out to Thargomindah and Cooper Creek, that's my favourite part of Australia, and it's a completely neglected part of Australia. As I found when I started writing about it, very few people travel there. People are astonished to find that you're going there to do something. People tend to travel through the area, perhaps if they're on the way to Birdsville to do something, the big red patch or one of those things in the Simpson Desert or the Birdsville races, but people tend not to travel for tourist purposes to Cunnamulla, Thargomindah, Quilpie, Charleville, St George and so on. I absolutely fell in love with that region, absolutely.
So what's going on? Why don't people travel to those countries as tourists?
Well, it's a good question. I think people think there's really nothing there, because people, there's not spectacular mountains, there isn't lovely beach and so on. There aren't lots of green forest. It's a very kind of wiry, unforgiving sort of landscape. But one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was to move away from this idea, which you find again and again and again in writers, in filmmakers, and so on, this idea that the interior of Australia is a harsh and deadly place. And I wanted to say, well, for a start, it's been home to Indigenous people for thousands of years, for a start. But secondly, I think as new arrivals in this continent, I think it's important to learn to love those places as well, because they have their own terrible beauty. And the colours are so subtle and nuanced out there, as are the creatures, as are the trees. I think it's a sort of landscape which you have to examine it very, very closely to appreciate what it is. And I think in making that close examination of the landscape, you come, and certainly in my case, you come to a much deeper appreciation of the peoples who had lived there before. And you also just come to, I think, a much deeper appreciation of Australia in general.
Now, if there aren't great numbers of tourists going to southwest Queensland, there are great numbers going to Andalusia and going through Spain.
Yes.
So can you tell us something about your love of that country and how it is that you've come to become an Hispanist?
Yes. Oh, well, that's quite a long story. Perhaps I should explain before I explain about Andalusia why they are the two areas, because there was someone who suggested early on that perhaps the two didn't match, or that they'd been kind of randomly put together, and it wasn't that at all. There were very specific reasons why these two places were chosen. My love of southwest Queensland, I've explained, although we could talk a lot more about it, of course. The love of Spain in general is something which has been all my adult life. So I've been going to Spain. I've lived in Spain for many years, and I've been travelling there for 30, 35 years, it frightens me now to say. You know, the south of Spain is an area where I've travelled a lot. I've never lived there though, but it struck me when I started looking into, if we go back, just this relates to what you're asking here, if we go back about a decade ago, there's a particularly interesting moment historically where in late 2007, the then socialist government in the Spanish Parliament passed a law called the Law of Historic Memory, which is basically a law to pardon all the sentences which have been passed down by Franco's military courts. And it was also a law to provide funding for communities to basically uncover their dead and memorialise their dead who had been lying abandoned for 50 and 60 years. That was happening, and only 3 months later, in the Australian Parliament, Rudd got up and gave the apology to the stolen generations. And I've always been interested in the fact that those two things happened very closely, and it just happened to be the two countries where I have divided my adult life. Now, of course, you can talk about issues around South Korea, Argentina, Chile, Russia, any number of countries. But that just happened to be the two countries where I've divided my adult life. So I wanted to do some exploration of this idea of what is still lying below the surface in Spain. Quite a lot of stuff has been written about it, but
tell us about it. What happened in Spain? What happened in 1936? Can you give us short background for those who aren't intimately familiar with
Yes, indeed. Well, I mean, 1936 was the start of the Spanish Civil War, and what I wanted to, I think most people probably have a fairly fair idea of what happened during the Spanish Civil War, and the way that the legitimate government of the Second Spanish Republic was overthrown by invading troops from North Africa under General Franco, and some troops who came down from the north of Spain as well, from around San Sebastian and Burgos, who came down. So the idea was to create a pincer movement to move on Madrid, and they thought that it would, all be over in a couple of weeks. Of course, it lasted 3 years. Terrible, loss of 500,000 lives. But what I found was that when you read, as an English speaker, when you read accounts of the Spanish Civil War, you're kind of limited to the great names like Orwell and Koestler and Hemingway and so on, or you've got the great Hispanists, so Paul Preston, obviously, Gerald Brennan, Stanley Payne, so on and so forth, Anthony Beaver, and so on. But when I started speaking to Spanish historians and reading Spanish sources and digging into some archives over there and talking to people, this whole other dimension of the Spanish Civil War opened up. And it was really a dimension that was much less about the strategy of the battles. Because anyone who studies as an English language speaker, when you study the Spanish Civil War, you'll study all those key battles around Barcelona and Madrid and so on. But I was particularly interested in Andalusia because this was where those three columns of troops came up with this attempt to move up onto Madrid from the south of Spain. And the histories that I began to uncover with the help of local Spanish historians were these very, very granular grassroots stories of what happened to the people in the villages. And in many cases, as the troops came up and invaded and took over village by village, they conducted a truly appalling series of massacres, which a lot of people don't know about. Certainly in the English language people don't really know about it. And even a lot of Spanish people, they kind of know, but the details of it, when you start digging down into it, it's truly shocking, some of the stuff that happened. And this is one of the reasons why parts of the book were quite difficult to write, because I think there's no point in not being fairly upfront about, look, this is what happened. And I kept being struck by the parallels between the way in which these entirely innocent people were massacred and the parallels of what happened in southwest Queensland. because in both cases, in both cases, the point that I want to emphasise is that we tend to put these things under a rubric or under a description of victims of war. It wasn't war, right? It was cold-blooded murder. Yeah? There was one side had done nothing to provoke the other side. Right? When we think about war, we think about two contending parties. You know, there's a dispute. Yeah, there was no dispute here, right? In southwest Queensland, the lands were simply invaded, and the Indigenous people were killed, or they were, you know, taken away to missions and so on, and reservations. And again, the villages of southern Spain, the people were massacred, and truly appalling things happened. The troops would come into a town, and they would just line people up and start shooting them, and anyone who was in any way associated with the left-wing association, Republican, whatever, and very often, as I describe in the book, very often what happened was that the men folk had fled because they were basically fighting the resistance. But what it did mean was the people left behind were very exposed, and they were often brutally massacred, women and children. Really, really appalling. So that was.
And you write a lot in the book about the discovery of mass graves, or the rediscovery of mass graves. Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, this is an interesting thing. Again, I was looking for points of comparison, but also points of difference between the Australian experience and the Spanish one. And we don't have memorials in Australia to the victims of the frontier wars. And again, I'm ambivalent on the use of the word war, because I think it was so one-sided. It wasn't really what you might conventionally term a war. So we don't have the memorials here. We don't really know where to look for the bones, if they even exist. You do hear stories of people out in Western Queensland, ploughing up somewhere and some bones turn up. It's very hard to say who those bones might belong to. They might belong to, a young stockman from 100 years ago. They might be Indigenous bones. But what often happens is when bones are revealed, people quickly cover them up and just, because what happens and what's been happening in Spain is that when bones are uncovered, a whole apparatus for the state moves into place. So then you have to follow certain procedures. And this is one of the things. There are some astonishing stories that I was told, and I was told by multiple people, so I'm prepared to believe this, that during the 1980s and 1990s, there was a real estate boom, construction boom in Spain, and in a lot of villages when they were clearing land for new things, bones of victims of the Civil War were uncovered, and they just put them in and threw them in as landfill and put them under the foundations. They just didn't want it, because it's too much trouble to think about it. So there is an incalculable number of people whose bones are now forever buried under a car park or a high-rise building or a hypermarket or something, and they'll never ever be found. It was only from about, as I say, with the law of historic memory in sort of 2008, that there's been a much more rigorous attempt to actually scientifically classify all the bones and try to locate who they belong to and so on. And that's something that, in Australia, we just can't do now, at this remove from 1850s southwest Queensland. That's just all lost now. And in Spain, they're lucky that they are managing to put the stories together. There's a website called Todos los Nombres, or All the Names, and it's a website put together by a civic group in Andalusia. And what they're doing is they're trying, when they identify bones of someone, dead person, what they then do is they then try and reconstruct that person's life story, because a lot of these people were completely anonymous. And, of course, they died at a time when lives were not particularly recorded, and they're doing an astonishing job of putting together little biographies of all these people who've been missing for now 80 years, and every single one of them would be a novel. They're just astonishing, some of the stories, things that happen to people, and then you see them again and again and again and again. Can I just say one more thing? Sorry, Simon, about this. We talk about the number of the people who were massacred there. One of the things that deeply affected me as well was realising how when the Francoist troops came through, how they really focused on teachers. There'd been
What's dangerous about teachers? What's not dangerous about teachers?
they teach
Education is deeply political and always has
they
been.
teach people to think. That's the problem. There'd been a thing in the Spanish Second Republic, and this is another thing I must say. When you go into the Spanish sources, we tend to have, or people who study Spain from outside, a lot of people tend to have a fairly rosy view of the Second Spanish Republic. It had some serious problems. I mean, it was violent in many ways. It was disorderly in many ways. So it was not a perfect system by any means. But one of the most wonderful things that they did was they set up a thing called the Rural Education Movement. And this involved men and women going out and just walking from village to village and going and teaching young children how to read and write. These are kids who'd never been to school. These are little villages who barely even had a school. And so these people would put a satchel on their back, they'd walk from place to place. They didn't get payment, they just would get a place to sleep and to be fed. That's all they got. And they spent years walking around slowly educating other people. And they were some of the first to be shot when this came in. Yes. And there's a terrible story that I translated from a source in the book. I mentioned this when I spoke with Phil Patton, so if you've heard that interview, you know this story about a town actually in the northeast of Spain where one of the men who was forming the group of people to execute this old man and his wife who'd been teachers all their lives in the village. That old man and his wife had taught to read and write the children of the man who shot them.
And that really is a moving story that you capture in Amnesia Road, right?
Well, we just wonder how many more stories there are like this in Australia that we just don't know about. It's a great absence.
And so what you do in the book is you look for points of comparison, points of similarity, points of difference, and you tease them out. And your book is full of questions.
Yes.
And you don't necessarily answer all the questions you ask, but you pose question after question after question. And one of the things you say fairly early on in the book is you say that at both ends of the world, I found confusion and profound disagreement about how to read the story of the past, about who should write or speak it, and what parts of it should be written or spoken about at all. Now, that's a pretty challenging notion, isn't it? That some aspects of the past perhaps would not be spoken about at all. Can you just tease that out a little bit for us?
I don't think that's the case. Can I just say that when I'm asked questions like that or make statements like that, sometimes it applies differently to the Australian case to the Spanish case, right? Because they are different.
And I must say, I read that as being more relevant to the Spanish experience.
It was, and it's difficult to say where is the deeper wound. It's probably the cultural devastation in Australia. And I wouldn't suggest that there are parts of Australia's past that we shouldn't talk about at all. But I do know that in a country like Spain, I think this is, you could say this is the case in Argentina and Chile, for example, as well, that there are a lot of effort has gone into trying to heal. And a lot of people get very frustrated or very angry about those who want to continually turn over the past. It's almost as if people say, look, we've had enough truth now. We've heard enough terrible things about the past. We know how much our grandparents suffered and our parents suffered. They've gone through that terrible time. We've suffered a dictatorship, all the murders that happened. But we've kind of come together in a common effort to try and build a new democratic society. And can we please just keep going along that road rather than continually revisit the past because it's so painful for so many people. So it's very, very hard. It's hard to say to people, look, you shouldn't be examining the past. Oh, I don't say to people you shouldn't be examining the past, but it's a very hard case to make. That, look, is it, and again, I just ask the question, are there sometimes in certain countries a case to be made to just leave things now? Just leave things now. It's very hard to ask people to do that, but sometimes you think, well, there are a lot of people who just want things to be left alone. And I don't mean people who have necessarily got something to hide, right? Although there are those as well, of course. But there are other people who they just want, you know, who, I hear this again and again in Spain, can we just live in peace now? You know, we're in our second, third generation of peace. Can we just have the peace keep going, please? Let's not keep going back.
Whereas that's not the case here.
No,
is
no.
I mean, we're still on a journey of coming to understand the depth of the silences that have been at play in this country.
Very much so, very much so. And I hope that this book will, in some small way, help to redress that by focusing on a particular corner of Australia that has been largely neglected. And I've got to pay tribute to the people who have done the research before me, of course, and the Indigenous people themselves. So I've just sort of added a grain of sand, if you like, to that. But hopefully it fills in a little bit more of the knowledge that's been lost in Australia.
When you explore silences, you also explore notions of forgetting and of unknowing.
Yes.
And I wondered whether you could just expand on that a little bit for us. What's the difference between forgetting and between unknowing?
Yes. Well, I think one's a conscious thing and one is not. Forgetting is, I think, a deliberate attempt to ignore the past, right? Unknowing is what I think a lot of people are trapped in the sense that there's so much in the past that you just don't know about. And it's often shocking to find out about it. Right? So it's not that, I mean, if I was to tell you, you know, these series of things happened out west of Cunnamulla in the 1860s or 1870s, you'd probably never heard about that before. Now, you might understand it in the context that we know that, that there were frontier wars and massacres in rural Australia and so on, in that context. But otherwise, a lot of people, and keep in mind, this sort of material, the vast majority of people pay no attention to this whatsoever. You know, and this is one of the things that I talk about in the book, is that how, when we talk about these issues around our past and seeking justice for Indigenous people, you know, the reality is a lot of Australians actually don't care. You know, they're living another life, and that's what they do. You know? And I'm not saying that people need to be, you know, obsessing on this all the time, but I think that, you know, you need to dedicate time and space to thinking about these things. Unknowing. People can have dreadful things in their past that they are simply ignorant of. And I'll just give one very, very brief example, because I talked about this in a conversation with my first book, because this sort of question came up briefly at one point. In Australia, we had the stolen generations, right? In Spain, there were many young babies were taken from their mothers. I say in the book, in Australia, there was an attempt to breed out the colour. You know? In Spain, the attempt was to breed out the politics. They would take young babies from so-called red mothers, you know, or politically dangerous mothers, and give them to worthy families. And that happened a lot in Argentina as well during the terrible years of the dictatorship. I don't want to go any further into that because it's very, very distressing. But just
extraordinary what we are prepared to do to break up families in order to achieve political ends.
Yes. But here's the situation. Let's imagine you're that baby who was taken from your mother and father. Your mother and father were then executed by a military junta, and you're put with another family. 40 years later, you've got no idea whatsoever that that's what happened. No idea what, you can't possibly know that that's what happened. You've grown up with what you believe is your mum and dad because you've known them from you were 2 weeks old. So 40 years later, someone, an historian, a person who's investigating, discovers the truth. Do you tell that person? Because you're basically going to ruin their life. You know, you're basically going to, you're going to tell that person your whole life has been a lie. This is not your mother and father. And in some cases, what's more, the person who's your father was the one who actually killed your biological mother and father. Yeah. So do you tell somebody that? And one of the things that I ask in the book is, well, what is served? Like, I don't know. I can't answer that question. It's just, I guess it's an ethical dilemma that I wanted to put. Do you give that terrible information? But so it comes down to the question of, you know, what price do we put on truth? You know, when do we say, look, we must tell the truth? Or are there things that we find out and we think it's really just not worth anyone knowing about that? Because it's going to cause so much pain in the present. To raise, this was what happened 40, 50 years in the past. It's going to cause so much pain in the present. Imagine finding out that your mother and father weren't your mother and father, you know, and that the circumstances of how you came to with their child were extraordinarily traumatic and murderous. God, that would ruin your life. And the baby is completely innocent of any of this, who's now the adult. So that's the question of unknowing. That's one example of unknowing. You know.
And is it also an example of a circumstance which challenges the histories that Victor's right, challenges the grand, I think the phrase you use, the grand narratives of history.
Yes.
Is that just one example of many that bubble away, erode, and challenge in various ways those grand narratives? Yeah,
look, I think, you know, we've probably come from a time where there were too few narratives about history. But one of the questions I wanted to ask, because it was essentially, well, this is how history was. You and I remember, I think I'm a bit older than you, Simon, but you know, back in primary school, when you're taught there's one version of history and that's it. You know? And as you grow up and things branch out and the new voices join in and tell their stories, and history becomes much more diverse, more complex, more nuanced. One of the things that I ask in the book is, though, when we have so many different versions of history, does that then create a new problem for us? Because we can't really decide on, okay, if we're trying to decide on who we are as a nation or what our history means, when everything is divided down into those very narrow and individualistic interpretations or understandings of history, is there a common thread anymore? That's a question. As you said, thank you, Simon. It's a book of questions. It's not a book of providing answers. I don't think anyone wants to go back to the white bread one version of history. Of course, Australia. That's just not Australia anymore. It hasn't been Australia for a long time. But one thing that I pose, because I look at, I more and more I try to spend less time on social media. But when historical controversy,
not tonight. Tonight's okay. Social media away. All of this.
When historical controversies and arguments often erupt, and you do see that a lot of people on both sides argue without any real care for historical facts. Yeah? And you think, well, this is just becoming a slanging match from entrenched positions, and no one's going to, what's even the point of arguing? You're never going to concede even 1 inch to the other side, right? So what even is the point? Yeah? And I see that happening more and more and more, and people are further and further entrenched and are less. Now that might just be the nature of social media, yeah? Which, I talk about the impact of digital technologies on sort of knowledge and understanding of the past in the book. But it's something that I worry about it, but it's something that came to my attention I thought was worth discussing in the book, that I think narrower and narrower definitions of history mean that there's, I think there's got to be a place somewhere for a larger vision of a national history, but it's very, very hard to agree on what that is.
And indeed, social media has allowed voices that would otherwise be voiceless to have a platform, but to have a way of communicating their stories. And some of those stories which challenge the grand narratives.
Exactly.
And grand narratives that need to be challenged.
Yes, yes, indeed.
The digitalization of history is something
Yes.
you've just referred to it then.
Yes.
Can you tell us something about that process? What do you mean by the digitalization of history?
Well,
and what challenges does that issue?
Well, probably the digitization of history is not quite the right expression, more the digitization of knowledge, I guess. Look, I think I mentioned a brief anecdote in the book where a friend of mine who was writing a book in Sydney some years ago, she began researching the book, and when she came, close to publication of the book 5 years later, she came to check these references. All this stuff had been digitized, and some of the new books had just been chucked out, right? And so I worry about this terrible loss of the actual physical archive. Right? And there was an incident at the ANU a couple of years ago where they moved to create space for a new sort of digital centre. They moved all these archives down into a basement, and they got flooded. And all these, 50 years of people's PhD theses that were just lost. Yeah? So I worry in that sense that the old physical tactile stuff is still really, really important. And I think the digital world tends to, because it's all based on 1 and 0, and that just encourages this kind of black or white. There's no grey. I think the nature of that of digital technology itself is against nuance. Give me the human brain any day. I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah.
And so we're in a world where experience is digitized, when accounts of history are being digitized and some accounts are being lost as a result of that.
Yes.
And where, at least in relation to Indigenous Australia, there is something of an absence of written records.
Yes.
What does that absence of records speak to in this country, and is there a similar absence in Spain?
There is to some extent in Spain, but probably not as much. Look, I think it makes it quite difficult because I say in the book that anybody who studies or writes history knows that there's a lot of controversy, but there's a lot of disagreement around the value of oral history, to what extent it can be relied on or cannot, right? And you see that in any court case, I mean, is a person telling you the truth or not, and do you find that out under cross-examination? To what extent do you say, we trust what this person says, or to what extent do we suspect that maybe that person's not telling the truth? Or maybe not telling the truth, not that they're lying, but I mean, there's any number of examples that we could reference of people who have, their memory's not quite right. I mean, we'd all imagine things from our own lives. We think, oh, geez, I remembered it that way, but it actually happened that way. So it's very hard because so much of Australia's Indigenous history is oral, and that's how it's been passed down. It's not only in Australia, but in many other countries as well. So I think that's an additional challenge that we face in terms of understanding our national history. And here's the thing: it's very easy for certain kinds of historians, and we don't need to mention any names, to really attack that, right? And that's not valid either, right?
It's a cheap attack.
It's a cheap attack. It's an absolutely cheap attack. But there are nevertheless, I think, long-term oral history, it's hard. It's very, very hard to say, okay, at what point do we say, yep, we accept absolutely this is how it was, or do we say, well, look, this is a version that has come down to us, and we accept that as a version, but we actually just can't ever know. This is the thing. I think sometimes when I was out around Surat, Surat, and that area, and there's a magnificent chain of Indigenous rock wells that come up from sort of Dirranbandi up through this Weendal and Tomby, then there's some come up from Gundawindi and they move right up to the Bunya Ranges, which were watering places for Indigenous people as they did the annual trip up to the Bunya Ranges. And when I've stopped and I'm looking at those rock wells, which are incredibly preserved. We're very lucky that they are preserved. And you can't help but think, okay, who was standing here in 2000 BCE, for example, 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago? Who was standing here? How were these things being used? And then go back again, 10,000 years ago. When were these rock wells created? Were they carved? I mean, there's obviously evidence of carving, use of ochre around the outside of it, but are they wholly natural? Were they carved? And it's difficult to say. And the reality is, if we say what was the daily cultural practices of life 10,000 years ago in this country, which were obviously very rich, but how much the detail do we know about it? We know virtually nothing. And I mean, that's the same. I mean, I can say that's the same about people anywhere around the world. I mean, in Spain, just because we're talking about Spain before, I mean, you've got the magnificent cave paintings, which are 35,000 years old. But what do we really know other than the people who did those cave paintings? We don't really have much, and nor should we expect to, because material culture doesn't last for 35,000 years. So there are these enormous absences. So I think that's a challenge for people trying to fill in a history of Australia. But I do also say in the book that is the history that goes back a long way. That's really for Indigenous people to tell.
There's a little anecdote that you tell in the book about a truck driver who is stopping. He stopped his long distance journey from wherever he was going to,
Yes.
The side of Rockwell, somewhere near Gundawindi, I think it might have been.
No, it was just outside of St George.
Yeah. Can you tell that story? Because it struck me that it was a beautiful story that broke stereotypes. Because you got a stereotype of a long distance truck driver wearing the blue singlet, and this man was not like that stereotype at all.
No, he wasn't. His name was Les. He was from Cunnamulla, and he was driving to Dalby to pick up his rig, which was parked at Dalby, and from there he was driving down to Brisbane to pick up a load of cattle to take all the way back out to Cunnamulla because things were very dry out there at the time. I stopped the side of the highway at a place called Tomby. It's about 20 or 30 k's out of St George on the road to the road from St George to Dalby. Yeah.
Can I just test the audience? Anyone here ever heard of Tomby? We had lots of heads being shaken.
Somebody raised their hand down there. Tomby. It's actually a station name, but it's not a town. It's not a town called Tomby. There's a station called Tomby, and these rock wells are called the Tomby rock wells because obviously they don't know what the Indigenous name for it was. And I stopped by the side of the road and I was looking around, where are these wells? I can't see them anywhere. I'm looking around, I thought, maybe the sign's wrong or something. And then I noticed that they're right beside the side of the highway. I thought, well, they've only been preserved through sheer good luck. If you were preserving them, you wouldn't say, oh, let's just put the highway right beside it. I think they put the highway through and then they've gone, bloody hell, we better preserve this, put a little wire fence around it. So I'd stopped there, I found them. And well, in fact, I first got out and I said, mate, this is Les, this truck driver fella. And the other thing was he was smoking in his windshield, and it was about 45 degrees. You could hardly breathe. And I said, mate, do you know anything about these rock wells? He said, yeah, we're over there. And I went over to look at them, and he came over and he started bitterly complaining about some people who, a couple of years before, he had stopped there, and some people had come along and thrown rubbish in them. And he started bitterly complaining and setting up a really, really rigorous defence of Indigenous culture. He was disgusted that people would stop there and throw rubbish in these wells. And I was just, wow, that you wouldn't, here's a guy who, to all extents and purposes, you'd say would fit, you're kind of your redneck Queenslander. Not a bit. Huge respect. And he started talking to me about the Indigenous wells. Wow, this guy. Yeah.
And so, your book gives opportunities or tells stories about people asking questions. Les asking questions about the world around him.
Yes.
And questions that you've asked for us. And I wonder whether anyone in the audience now may have any questions for Luke and Chrissy, whether or not any questions have come through electronically for Luke.
I'm just asking about the electronic questions now, but if anyone in the audience,
Please.
Shall I go to one? Sure. Thanks, Lord. Thanks.
You're very welcome.
As I was speaking, I was thinking about Bosnia. I'm
Yes.
originally from Bosnia and Herzegovina. I joined lots of panelists. It could be a story from Bosnia
Indeed.
as well.
Mm.
With the students shooting their teachers, with the mass graves, with everything what you mentioned.
Mm.
But just a few things about how much we remember and how much we forget. And
Yes.
In Bosnia, there is a remembering fatigue.
Yes.
But it's a generational question. And
Yes.
I was wondering, the young generation, youth, were born after the war, during the war, which can't really remember.
Mm.
They're just fed up with these stories and they
Yes.
can't listen anymore. And there is also a reason for that. And there's a lot of literature coming out about silences.
Mm.
The silences may be good because it's not about remembering, it's about the ways we remember.
Mm.
So because political elites misuse this remembering and memorization, there is just a book published recently called Past Can't Heal Us that talk about this misuse of memorization to basically cement ethnic divisions, not to bring reconciliation. So in that sense, some scholars would argue that silences may be actually good. In particular, this is the second question, why it may be easier to talk about these issues than in Spain and Bosnia 25 years later, because basically in Bosnia, half of the country were victims, half perpetrators, and they're still alive.
Yes.
So I know women who are meeting perpetrators on the street
Yes. Yes.
because they served their sentence, they came back
Yes.
to the
Yes.
communities,
Yeah.
and they have to deal with that. And in Rwanda and so on. So they are still living, they remember,
Yes.
and
Yes.
this is all generation who are still
What-
there. And
What you say about that remembrance fatigue is a very real thing, and I think I mentioned that in Spain. The other thing you mentioned there is very true as well. That you've got to be careful. There are a lot of unscrupulous politicians who try to make this for as I say in the book, it's one thing for the families who wish to go and uncover their dead. And you have to provide them with the resources, the time and the space to do that, and the space to memorialise and commemorate. What really makes me angry is then when that's used for political purposes. I say in the book at one point, how useful are the dead, to be brought back across the sticks and ferried up into the world of the living to be used as political pawns. It's appalling.
Luke, I'm really looking forward to reading your book.
Well, thank you.
Many years ago, it was just about the positive aspect of Andalusia. Many years ago, I remember when I was interested in anarchism as a utopian sort of
Yes.
political philosophy. I read a book and a lot of stories about experiments just before the Civil War or during it, where money was abolished and they were trying to set up anarchist collectives. Do you want to share anything about that?
I know because you'd be testing me there, but I do know that during the period of the Second Spanish Republic, there were a lot of social experiments of that sort around. I mean, it was a revolutionary time for the role of women in society, particularly. There were a lot of experiments in alternative ways of social organisations, abolishing money and so on. A lot of those experiments didn't work, I have to say, but certainly people gave it a go, and needless to say, when Franco's side, if you like, won the Civil War, a lot of the rights that women had won were wound back as well. No, I'm not an expert on that, but certainly that happened. Yes.
Questions? Thank you.
Hello.
I am Hispanic and Australian, so
Wonderful. Thank you.
so this is very interesting to me.
Right.
And I'm wondering if in your research on this topic
Yes.
you have noticed any key cultural difference in how Australians and Spanish deal with this kind of issues.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I think you'd find that in Spain, I think it's more present simply because it's more recent. I mean, what we're talking about, that's not to say that there aren't still enormous injustices against Indigenous people, but what we're talking about here was particularly the process of cleansing that happened in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. Yeah. So that's now 150 years ago. In Spain, it's only 80 years ago, and it was. So this is the question. Apart from now me saying that in some cases, I don't think these people were victims of war, they were victims of murderous atrocities. But it's also an interesting question as to whether in Australia, the frontier wars were actually a civil war, because they were two groups of people in the same land struggling for control of the land and the resources. Right? Now, one was, numerically much stronger than the other, and it was not a fair fight at all. But when you read things about how Australia, our first war was Boer War of Gallipoli, or this is where the flagship was forged, all that stuff, which is kind of nonsense. But you think, well, should Australia maybe consider those frontier wars as a civil war? Would depend on how you define Australians, of course, but yeah, it's a tricky question.
Any questions, Steve?
Thank you, Luke. I'm looking forward very much to reading your book too.
John?
One question that interests me is whether you found any discouragement from either side of the frontier wars to your part of trying to chronicle it. That I'm just thinking of the whole question of who owns history.
Yes, yes.
And the explicit or implicit desire of people who put themselves definitely on one side to claim the territory of that side, and that if you come from the other side or where you come from doesn't matter, that it's this is our story and you have no right on it. And I think that applies probably more implicitly to the white settlers than to the Aborigines, more explicit there. That's our history, bugger off.
Yeah.
Did you get any of that kind of discouragement?
None whatsoever.
Wow.
None whatsoever. No. And in fact, it's a point that I'm at pains to make in the book at a number of places, is that I think that there seems to me, as far as I can see, there seems to be different dialogues about race going on in Australia. And in rural Australia, and again, I don't speak for rural Australia by any means, but what I'm constantly surprised, or perhaps not, to find is just how well people get on with each other. And they're just getting on with living and getting on with it. And that's not to say there aren't still injustices and problems and so on, there are. But people are looking to find just really practical day-to-day ways of living together and solving each other's problems. And I find that happens a lot in rural Australia. And incidentally, that's something that I do have a side career, if you like, as a referee in state amateur boxing. And if ever there's a sport where anybody and everybody comes together and operates on a totally equal level, absolutely everybody, and I think there's a lot of concerned conversations around race that I tend not to hear in those places, and that's possibly because that's not top of mind for those people. And I'm talking about all sorts of people, Pacific Islanders, Indigenous people, Europeans, other white Australians, and so on. So I think without wanting to judge either side of that equation, I do see different conversations about race going on in different parts of Australia, and I'm actually quite positive. I'm quite optimistic because I see a hell of a lot of goodwill in rural areas of Australia in terms of reconciliation, people living together, because there's no other option, basically. People aren't still trying to wage the wars of 150 years ago. People have moved beyond that.
And on one last question. We've got one more.
Oh, was that? Sorry.
Is it okay if I go?
Two questions.
We'll do two.
Well, hey Luke, I have read your book a few times. So I wanted to say something which is, I suppose, I hope it doesn't come off too much as a comment. I'd love to hear what you think. But I think from listening to this conversation, one would get the impression that it is a rigidly political book to read, that it's argumentative.
Yes.
Whereas for me to read the book, and I think when you were discussing how people seem to have missed out on the landscape part a lot more than you would have liked, it is a book that seems to sit above a level of sheer politics.
Yes.
Attempts to discuss things in a really aesthetic way.
Yes.
As in, you talk about the guy Les that you see on the road. What's interesting about Les is not that he's not more enlightened because he's a writer or anything like that. He's more enlightened because he lives there.
That's
This is
right.
where he goes.
Yes.
You know, so much of what we don't see is the stuff we manage to package up and say, I don't have to think about this very much.
Yes.
So there's in your attempt to actually bring the landscape itself to life.
Yes.
Which is what
Yes.
it says. Well, if you can turn yourself away from it, this is harder now, isn't it? When you read this, when you hear it put in this language, this is a lot harder for you to turn away from it and say, I don't want to see that.
Oh, indeed. But thank you for saying that it's not an overtly political book. I mean, a book that asks questions rather than, it was overtly political, it would have been full of dogmatic responses, yeah? But it's not. It's all full of questions, yeah? And I've got to just say briefly, Simon rang me the other night and said, I want to start off the discussion talking about your prose. And I think goodness, finally someone wants to talk about the quality of the writing rather than just the political issues which are raised. Yeah? Thank you, because that's kind of like, that is really the most important thing, I think, is the quality of the writing. Yeah.
I think one more question, and then I think then we're getting to the end of our time.
Okay, sure.
I'll be super quick.
Sure.
I thought the book was beautiful,
Thank
and
you.
I come from out that way,
Yes.
and you made me see it through your eyes. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
From an educator's perspective,
Yes.
how can we tell these stories better in our education
Wow. Gee, that was the easy question at the end, wasn't it? I think there's no other way than just to be as honest as possible. You know, don't be dogmatic about stuff. This is the thing. Don't be rigid. I think it's you've got to. Any historical account has to take account of the fact that there are a lot of people on different sides of equations. I mentioned briefly, I got another minute, Chris, just one more minute. I just mentioned towards the end of the book a Spanish writer, a young woman who's written very perceptively about the cultural representations of the Basque struggle and 30 years of Basque terrorism, terrible situation, still very much an open wound in Spain. But she says, you know, the first step in that is you have to understand that on any side of that, on any side of violence, there are people suffering on both sides. And that's not to be sort of, oh, let's just sort of play it down the middle and, you know, not offend anybody. No, that's saying, and I've got pains in the book to say, in both of these situations I'm describing, the quantitative murder on one side was vastly outweighed that on the other side. So there's no question about that. But in any situation of violence, there's always someone suffering. And you might not have any sympathy for a murderer who's gone down. But that murderer has a mother, a sister, a father, a brother, you know, who are innocent people who are suffering because they've seen their family be involved in it. And so you know, there is always suffering. You might not feel any sympathy for the perpetrator, but the perpetrator has people around them who often are entirely innocent. So that's just one of the things. And that Spanish woman writes beautifully about that whole concept of what are the discourses that we use to frame and talk about victims and talk about perpetrators. And it's very, very interesting stuff. Yeah, and she's writing about something which is very raw in contemporary Europe.
And that segues really nicely to what I'd like to do is just read one sentence from the very end of your book. And this captures something of the optimism of the book, actually. And in your last section, home.
Yes, can I just say what that is? Not without, yeah. The very last chapter of the book is called Home, and it's just me talking about where I've lived for the last 7 years in the scenic ring that used to be my mother and father's place.
And so Luke Stegemann, who's been living in the scenic ring, walks out of his home one evening, looks up at the stars and reflects that such nights were not made for modern humans, were mostly defenseless against temperature extremes and against the depths of mystery. And this book explores mystery.
Yeah.
So thank you, Luke.
Thank you so much.
And can I also take this opportunity while the mic's in my hand to thank Avid Reader, who tonight have supported a marvellous book by Luke in the way that they support so many marvellous books in this country.
It's an absolute delight to have two guys who are just so gentle and thoughtful, and who put so much effort into their work as well here. So we are in the presence of two incredibly great writers tonight. And to celebrate Luke's new book, we're going to get into his signing table, and then we're going to have more of a chat to him. So we'll get him out first, and then as soon as we're gone, we will be able to mob him and get your book signed and chat a bit further out in the world. So while he's packing his book up, thank you very much. One last clap for Luke Stegemann and Amnesia Road. Yeah.
It's a fabulous book. It's worth getting.
Because I'm walking with him every night, I read that as a